on the screen, you should be able to see our webinar agenda. We will get started with a marketing introduction. Then I will hand it off to Mark Lavelle, who will work on the GDPR requirements. He will talk about the cloud apps that can help, as well as the forms, imports, and subscription management. And finally, we'll have a demo of our cloud apps presented by Tom Sajcik, our CTO and founder. Today's speakers, my name is Sebastian Martinez. I've been with Forza Marketing with over 6 years now, have 10 years of experience in the MarTech industry, and it's a pleasure to have you all here with us. We also have Mark Lavelle, our CEO and founder. He is our GDPR specialist, and as such, he will be leading this presentation. And finally, Tom Sajcik. He is our CTO and co-founder, and he will be in charge of the demo portion of this webinar. Now, let's continue with the Forza Marketing introduction. Okay, as many of you know, we are a gold certified member, and we have been part of the OPN network for a number of years now. We have been in the ecosystem for 10 plus years, helping out with services and products that focus on the Eloqua marketing automation platform. Now, to get started, we will be presenting a poll, which each of you should have on the screen. This poll will give us a good sense of where you are in the stages of GDPR implementation. So on the screen, you should be able to vote. If you're at stage 0, you haven't started. Stage 1, still stuck in legal. Stage 2, forms updated with consent. Stage 3, implementing EU citizen rights. Stage 4, integrations implemented. Or stage 5, you're all done and ready for May 25th. So I will give you 10 or 15 seconds to vote. I see that there is a lot of action. That's wonderful. And after that, I will hand it off to my colleague Mark, who will kick off with the GDPR presentation. Mark, we have a good number of votes come in, so I will hand it off to you. And you can talk to which appears to be stage 1, still stuck in legal.
Terrific. Thank you, everybody. I'm not seeing the results here, Sebastian, so I may need you to talk to them. Could be something I'm doing wrong in the process here, but maybe you need to close down the poll, or if you could quickly tell us what the results are.
Of course. The stage with the most votes is still stuck in legal. That's stage 1 with 22 participants voting that section. And on second place, you have 6 people on stage 3 implementing EU citizen rights, and 11% voted stage 2. So it seems that most of our attendees are within the stages 1 and 3.
Terrific. Well, thank you for that, Sebastian. And that is actually very much consistent. Here we're now seeing it on screen. Thank you, Sebastian. So this sort of result is very much what we've seen for all of our customers, really for the last 3 or 4 months. Legal is having a difficult time sort of getting on top of the technology side of this. The technical side is having difficulty getting on top of the legal side of it. And the net result is that there's really a disconnect here, and that's really what this webinar is trying to help with. First of all, I'm going to put myself on screen. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and start off. You can see me here. Just like to let you know who's speaking, and let's go ahead and dig right into it. So first thing I have to say, of course, is a safe harbor. We're going to talk today about a number of things that involve legal issues. We are not attorneys, and obviously for any sort of legal advice, you should go to your attorney or legal firm. Now, there's a number of things we're not going to cover today. I'm going to go through them very quickly. I'm not going to talk about the penalties related to GDPR, the different ways you can be sued, the compensation that occurs. I'm not going to talk about some of the moral perspectives. I do think that GDPR has a lot of value from sort of a high integrity perspective, but we're not going to talk about that today. I'm not going to talk about the history of GDPR. And the reason I mention this is there's a lot of important things that you can talk about GDPR, but I found that they have been covered in a lot of other presentations. Today, we're going to really focus much more on the tactical and specific, but there are a few definitions I want to cover first. First of all, GDPR is an international law effectively for any company that wants to sell into the EU. There are 28 EU member states. There are 3 more European, the economic area of the European Union that also take effect. And UK is also complying, albeit under technically a different law, with something that's very, very similar, almost identical to GDPR. Another definition I want to talk about here briefly is what is a natural person. Now, all this really says is a natural person is any individual who can be identified. They have a nice long definition here. But the interesting thing about the natural person definition is that it relates to whether somebody can be identified or not. And I'm going to come back to that more in a little bit. I'm going to talk about some of the players involved here. Basically, there are 3 players that you should be aware of. The first is the data subject. The data subject is basically the contacts that are in your CRM database or your marketing automation database. There is the controller of your system, and in this case, you are the controller of your Eloqua system or your CRM systems or the other systems in your organization. And then there's the provider or the cloud processor of the system. And this, of course, in the case of Eloqua is Oracle, or in the case of Salesforce is Salesforce system is Salesforce itself. I'll be using these 2 terms especially during the course of this presentation. So it's good to recognize that the data subject just means the contacts within your system. So going back to personal data for a second, the definition of personal data in the system, and this is the data we're going to be talking about that must be protected and processed and handled in very specific ways, means any information that relates to an identified or identifiable person. Now, we all know what identified or identifiable means. It means via an email address or a name or an address or an IP address. There's a number of ways to identify somebody. But if you take out the word identified or identifiable, because we understand that, I like the short version or abbreviated version of this because it just gives you a sense for how broad this law actually is. And basically it says here, personal data means any information relating to a person. And that's a huge definition because when you think of something like a lead score, for example, a lead score very well may relate to or does relate to a person. Anything, any sort of tracking that you do on a website is information that relates to a person. I'm not saying we're all going to comply with every, the full breadth of this definition, but it's very important for us to kind of have a sense or understanding of what it is. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the classifications of identifiability. First, I want to talk about, second, I want to talk about anonymous. So I've talked about personal data for a second. I now want to talk about anonymous data. And really what I want to say here is that there is no such thing as anonymous data anymore. There's a number of studies out there that indicate what's called de-identification, the process of taking the information that identifies a person out of a record. Basically what they're saying here, it doesn't work. If we go in and we look at current sort of breaches or situations that have occurred, the fact that Cambridge Analytica was able to take Facebook data and some of it was anonymous and turn basically 8 million records into 70 million records was done by something called de-anonymization. And this is basically using multiple files to look at a theoretically anonymous file and identify it. I like this especially an example in relationship to something that happened in New York recently. New York, thinking they were doing a good thing, released 1.3 billion taxi rides with the intention that the general public and the analysts in the world could figure out some better ways to run the taxi system. Well, as it turned out, not only could that information be de-anonymized, it was. Almost all of those taxi rides, the exact taxi driver, taxi company, taxi number was identified. They did that very quickly. And perhaps what's more important is that within a couple of weeks, 15%, in other words, some 300 million individual riders in the taxis had been identified by correlation with things like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and so forth. So it's arguable that anonymous data is no longer a thing. If you have a file and it's got some decent information, if you combine it with other files, it can be identified. So anonymous is kind of a very difficult term to use. There's a new term that has come into play recently called pseudonymous. And basically pseudonymous means pseudonymous information is such that if there's no other file associated with it, there's no additional information used, then it's anonymous. But it's not anonymous because it could be potentially identified. And so the reason this is important in relationship to GDPR is there are specific things that you can do with pseudonymous data that you can't do with personally identifiable information. The biggest one, in my opinion, is that you can use it beyond the purpose for which the data was originally collected. In other words, if you collected the data for the purposes of giving somebody an asset, you can now use it for beyond that purpose, perhaps seeing how your website is performing or doing analytics on trends in general. So understanding anonymous, pseudonymous, and personally identifiable information is pretty key here, pretty foundational, if you will. So the next thing I'd like to talk about are levels of compliance. Now, before I do, I think a lot of people have kind of had this experience in the last few weeks or months. Basically, they've said, wait a minute, I have to say for any EU system out there, EU citizen out there, I have to give them access to any information I store on them. I have to allow them to change it if it's wrong. I have to allow them to download it in machine-readable format. I have to allow them to delete it if they want to. I have to do that across all systems and tables. And on top of that, there's all sorts of consent rights that are layered. Holy smokes. This is potentially a daunting, unreasonable, and even impossible set of projects. And that is, in my opinion, true. Immediate, perfect, full GDPR compliance may be not possible, and certainly not possible by May 25th. So the question is, what exactly do you need to do now, or do you need to do first? So to do that, I'd like to create an analogy. We've all been in this situation. We're in a car, we're rolling down the freeway, and we see a little speed limit sign of some sort. And we have a choice. And commonly, we will make the choice of being fully compliant. We will drive a nice 55 miles an hour. We will be exactly obeying the law, and we will be being good kids. Now,
Mark, this is a good moment to introduce our second poll.
Oh, thank you. I forgot about that.
No
Please
problem.
go on. Actually, can I go a couple more slides before you do?
Absolutely.
Okay. It is on screen, so if you can pull that off. Just going to go a couple more. So you can be fully compliant at 55 miles an hour. You can also go 65 miles an hour, and you can probably be likely safe. You might go 75 or 85 miles an hour and probably be okay for a while, or you can go 85 or 95 miles an hour, and basically at that point, you're hoping nobody notices. So the point here is that this compliance continuum, this ratio of more compliant to less compliant is a real sort of situation also for GDPR and GDPR compliance. And this would be a good time for the poll, Sebastian. So we're going to put up a poll here real quick that asks you where on May 25th, which of course is now almost exactly a month away, where from a compliance level, where do you think your organization will be? We'll take a real quick one. Remember, this is anonymous. Nobody else can see your answers. And we'll give about 10 seconds here. In fact, I'll keep talking for a couple minutes while this goes on. In relationship to compliance, basically there's an increase in safety as you become more compliant and an increase in risk if you're less compliant. And there are also different levels of enforcement that we expect. If you are, sort of up in the likely safe zone, you might get a reprimand. If you're down here in the hope nobody notices, that's where the fines are most likely to occur. And finally, there's a dollar or financial impact here. As you become more compliant, of course, cost goes up. So with that said, do we have the results of our poll, Sebastian?
We do, and they are on the screen now.
Thank you. So we can see that we are expecting a few people, about 15%, 13%, to hope nobody notices, and we sympathize with you because that's pretty common. I'm actually surprised that the figures are up in these middle ranges. And people who are fully compliant, a tip of the hat, because that is a pretty huge objective, and I don't run into too many companies that are fully compliant. So let's go ahead and keep on going here. Most people, as we can see, are going to be probably okay for a while. And here we have a couple recommendations we'd like to make. First of all, make a conscious decision where you're going to be on the gradient scale in terms of May 25th and in terms of phases after that. Take a phased approach. Understand that most companies aren't going to be fully compliant on May 25th, as per the poll we just showed you, but you will want to obviously become more compliant over time and implement GDPR from a phased, gradually increasing compliant approach. So that's an overview of compliance. That concept of levels of compliance is important to consider as we look at the depth of what needs to be accomplished. Now, we have 8 compliance tasks that we generally sort of break GDPR down into. The black ones are ones that are really reserved for your legal department. We do touch a little bit on contracts, but mostly the black ones are ones that are covered by IT and or your legal department. The ones that relate to marketing and automation from an awareness perspective are awareness, data classification, data mapping, and forethought marketing as services related to those. Where we're really going to focus today, though, is on consent implementation and rights implementation. That's where the focus is going to be. And if we look at the regulations or the law specifically, we're going to break them into 2 categories. First of all, we have these black ones that are not really marketing automation related. I'm not even going to cover these in detail. These are things your attorneys need to do, your IT needs to do. They're processes that you need to put in place, but not ones that are specifically related to Eloqua or CRM generally. The ones we are going to cover today are the ones that are specifically related to marketing automation. And these are the right to consent and the right to restrict processing. This is basically the categorization of how you're going to process somebody's data and giving the EU citizens the right to control it, to turn on and off marketing, to turn on and off support information and service information, the right to control their data in terms of how it's processed, categories of processing within your organization. Second of all, the right to be informed. This is how their data is going to be processed, and making sure that you inform them what's going to happen with it, even if it's something as arcane as passing it off to Demandbase or Mintigo for lead scoring or appending. They have the right to be informed on that information. Then we're going to talk about the EU citizen rights, the right to access their information, also known as right to review, where they're allowed to see what you have about them that is personally identifiable. And remember how broad that definition is. The right to change it if it's wrong. So if you have my name spelled M-A-R-C and it should be spelled M-A-R-K, I have the EU citizen. If I was an EU citizen, I would have the right to change that. The right to portability, or retrieve the data, where you can download the data into your local system in machine-readable format. And of course, the right to be forgotten. If someone wants to take that information out of your system and say, please forget me, don't remember anything about me, make me go away, they have that right. And these rights, these are really the data subject rights, or the EU citizen rights. We also have some other related to marketing automation items. When they control that right to set the right to consent and right to restrict processing, you then need to suppress email sends to make sure that what they say you actually do. In addition, we need to provide proof of everything that's covered here. So all of these different areas, you need to not just be able to do this for the customer, you need to be able to prove you did it, when you did it, and how you did it. And provide proof of forgetting is very similar, but it's kind of a special case. So we have outlined that as a separate one. Now, anytime you take the law, something as complex as the pages and pages of documentation and regulation that GDPR provides, and you boil it down into, what is this, 9 boxes and maybe 20 or 30 words, you are dramatically oversimplifying something. But the simplification helps us talk about it and helps us get down to what we're going to do for each and every one of these boxes. I'm going to take a quick moment here and ask anybody if there are any questions. We have a question and answer chat area where you can type a question if you'd like. I am monitoring those, and if any questions come up, feel free to ask them at any time. I may or may not answer them depending on whether I'm going to answer them later or how relevant they are to the presentation, but feel free to fill in any questions at any time. So now what I'd like to do is take this down to getting very specific. We have promised in this particular presentation to not just talk about the law, as happens in so many presentations, but get down specifically into how you can implement it in Eloqua and related systems. So the first thing is, from a data audit perspective, you need to look at the data that exists in your system. And you need to investigate thoroughly what personal data is in there. I will tell you that the results typically will surprise you. We had one company recently who thought, when they were going through the data cookie, the web cookie audit portion, thought they might come up with 5 or 10 cookies, came up with 68 cookies that they were putting on people's machines and utilizing on their website. And remember that when you're looking and doing an audit of personal data, that the definition is very broad. Personal data is any information relating to a person that is identifiable.
We do have a question that came in. It says, how do we store provide proof of deletion if we have to delete the contact information?
It's a great question. I'll go ahead and answer it now, and I'll give a longer answer a little later. Basically, the law does allow you to store information for the purposes of complying with the law, number one. And number two, you must limit the information that is stored on someone only to the people who are necessary to act on the purposes for it. Now, what this means is that you can have a separate special place to store people you have forgotten, but you should only allow people who are your legal attorneys or data privacy officers access to that information. And I'll cover that question in more detail. Continuing on here, categorize and classify data at rest. So from a data audit perspective, first of all, you need to investigate your data. Excuse me, I accidentally went backwards there. In addition, we need to categorize and classify our data at rest. The two ways that are, a number of ways you can classify data. A lot of organizations have classified and categorized their data, but for GDPR, there's two specific ways you need to look at. Number one, by identifiability. As we talked about earlier, is this personally identifiable, or is it anonymous? Truly, completely, totally anonymous with other tables. There's no possible way you could resurrect who the CMO of such and such a unidentified company but located at this address is, and or is it pseudonymous? So that way you can define what you can do with it. And secondarily, by sensitivity. Now, most Eloqua customers don't have sensitive information, health information, credit card information, and so forth in their Eloqua system, but you should categorize and classify by sensitivity just in case, to make sure that you can say, we have looked for sensitive information and we don't have any. After you've accomplished number one and number two, you should map your data flows. And again, you should map them in a specific way, especially for seeing where and how data is flowing inside and outside of the EU. And number two, how it's flowing through data processors and sub-processors. Now, this is particularly important in relationship to products like Eloqua and Salesforce, because we have the App Exchange and we have Cloud Apps and we have all these tools in which it's so easy to just drag into our system, flow data through it, not realizing that involves a vendor, contracts, rights, permissions, consent, whole lot of things. So you want to actually check where your data is flowing, and with the cloud apps and App Exchange apps that are so prevalent in today's marketing and CRM world. Lastly, after you've mapped the data flows, we want to identify the key elements. We want to take a look at every field and say, do we need that field? Every record, and say, do we need that record? Remember, if you don't have a purpose that is tied to what the original customer gave you consent for, or a legitimate purpose, such as they asked you to fulfill an asset, if you don't have a purpose for information, you're not supposed to store it, not under GDPR. We also want to look at formats. Is it stored in SQL, Excel, Salesforce? Where is it stored? How do we transfer it around? Do we move it around via social media, via telephone, via secure sockets, via other internal methods? And where is it stored? So when you're looking at your key elements, you want to look at that from several dimensions. And these are all the things which need to be taken care of from a data audit. Now, that's all we're going to say from a data audit perspective. We're going to leave this largely to your organizations and IT departments, or by working with Forethought Marketing Services departments to explore further. We want to use the rest of this webinar to get down into the specifics on how to implement this within Eloqua and your CRM system. So first of all, we're going to talk about tables and inputs. And before I talk about tables and inputs for just a quick second, in our last presentation, our last webinar, we did not talk about Forethought Marketing's cloud apps that relate to this. Today, I am going to mention that we have 7 different cloud apps that specifically address these rights. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about them at this point. I just want you to know that they exist. You'll see them sometimes mentioned in the flows. Tom will be giving a demonstration of them here in a few minutes. But these cloud apps specifically utilize the underlying data structures and handle the inputs that flow into and around Eloqua and potentially your CRM system. So the first thing you need to do is capture all your input sources. You need to make sure that you are getting consent verification from any and every possible way data can get into Eloqua. And there are 3 or 4 different ways data can get into Eloqua. There are imports. Anytime somebody imports a list, basically you have information flowing into Eloqua, and you need to capture that. Just a quick question, Sebastian, Amanda, can someone confirm that audio is working okay?
Yes, Mark, I can hear you fine.
Great. We'll go ahead and continue. I just saw one person with a question on audio. It may be, unfortunately, that person's specific situation, so we'll continue. Second category of input sources is integrations. Obviously, information can flow in from your CRM system, which is most common, or it could flow in from an event management system like Cvent or Certain. It could flow in from an ERP systems in terms of product purchases. And then lastly, you have forms. And forms, subscriptions in Eloqua are really a special type of form, or really basically a form. So I said there's 3 or 4. These are kind of similar and kind of not. So we're going to call them 2 different input sources, but they're really very related to each other. And anytime somebody submits information via a form or a subscription, you need to make sure, again, you've got consent there. So basically, you want to check every single one of these input mechanisms to make sure that we have a record of consent when it comes in and that we can track it appropriately. So to do this, we recommend 3 tables be created. We actually use a few more than 3 tables with our cloud apps, but 3 is sort of the core, most important tables that you need to accomplish the goal. And the goal here, again, is we need to be able to demonstrate that we're actually complying with the law, and we're doing what we're supposed to be doing in accordance with the regulation as we go through it. So these 3 tables are: number 1, the consent verification log, where we store consent; number 2, the activity log, where the chief legal officer can see every single GDPR activity that has occurred; and relating to the question that was asked earlier, the GDPR right to be forgotten log, which is especially secured, as we'll see in just a second. So one of the reasons these are, a question we often get is, can't we just use the application's general activity logs to do this? And the problem is, a DPO or a CMO generally does not want to have to, and may not even be able to, dig through gigabytes of hard-to-access activity and form logs. If you look at the standard forms and the logs, activity logs, and the standard Eloqua activity logs, they want their GDPR data in a single provable location. This is especially valuable too if you should ever find yourself in front of a DPA, a data privacy authority, from one of the EU countries, or obviously getting a call from an attorney. It's nice to be able to say, hey, every activity we have for GDPR is there, right there, and that's all that's there. So we're going to go through these one by one. First of all, the consent verification log is pretty simple. It stores whether a particular contact is compliant. You could also do this in the contacts table. We like to keep this in a separate table, but either way really functions. And this is basically whether consent is there or not. This is a one-to-one sort of relationship with the contact table. And like I said, you can do this in the contact table if you want, but we find it better to be in a separate table. Item number 2 is the activity, or table number 2 is a GDPR activity log. So this table has a whole bunch of fields, a number of which aren't shown here. But what it does is it records every single GDPR activity that occurs. When somebody gives consent, which form did it come from? What time did it come in? When a salesperson says they got consent, what salesperson was it? What time was it? What text did they potentially verbalize to the customer when they gave consent? If someone executed their right to be their right to access information. Did they start that process but not finish it? Did they start that process and finish it? All of this are activities in this GDPR activity log that gives you one single place to go and say to someone, all of our GDPR information, legal verification, confirmation is right here. Third table we're going to talk about here is the right to be forgotten log. This one has sort of some self-evident purpose about it. It is where you store the information when somebody asks to be forgotten. Of course, when something is in this table, it is typically erased from all the other tables in the system. What's important about this table, though, is that only the key people who need to legally respond to legal requests have access to it. Marketers don't have access to it, so they can't accidentally choose to unforget somebody. Salespeople don't have access to it, so they can't decide they're going to call this person anyway and maybe mine the right to be forgotten log, some renegade salesperson. This is locked down and only accessible for the single purpose of addressing legal issues. And that's the right to be forgotten log, and I think perhaps more deeply addresses the question that was asked earlier. So we're now going to build on top of these tables, and there are more than this actually functional in our system, but these are the three core ones that you kind of need to understand. We're going to build some use cases, and we're going to build these or base these use cases on top of three categories, and these three categories are pretty simple. The first category is a marketing automation user or a CRM user actually does something within your organization. In other words, one of your team members, one of your employees does something. We have 4 use cases where an EU citizen actually does something, and these are where they exercise their rights and so forth. And then we have a reporting use case where a DPO or perhaps a CMO wants to see what's going on from a reporting perspective, and this one will actually show from a demonstration perspective. So if I fill in these use cases, we can see that there's 3 in the first category, 4 in the second, 1 in the third. And the first use case is a user imports a list, and we're going to cover that one in just a second. This is pretty basic. A marketing automation person imports a list. It happens often. The second one is a sales rep enters a new CRM contact. Again, that happens pretty commonly, but then it integrates over to the marketing automation system. And that's pretty key there because we need to be able to make sure that that information has consent. Consent is protected. In case number 3, we have a marketer sending emails out, but the ones that are supposed to be sent, and the ones that are not sent. So I'm going to run through those use cases, and actually I'm going to run through number 4 here as well, where a contact submits a form or manages a subscription. And before I do that, though, I'm going to go back really quickly and talk about our cloud apps, which help you with this process. Now, what we're going to show you in these use cases in just a second, much of it can be done in Eloqua with a lot of work. But it's hard to figure it out. It's hard to actually do it, and it's a lot easier to drop in the cloud app. And that's, of course, why we're our secret madness method behind our madness on providing this webinar today. We break our cloud apps into 2 different categories, what we call the input consent verification cloud apps, which I will touch on first, and then our legal rights apps, which I'll touch on second, and then Tom will come in and show us a couple of these functional along with our reporting and cloud menu app. So I'm going to go ahead and jump now to our first use case. So here we have an Eloqua user imports a list. Very common use case. Happens all the time. And in this particular use case situation, we have a product called an upload wizard. And what this upload wizard does is it controls the flow of information into Eloqua. It checks every country, and if it's a GDPR country, specifically looks for GDPR consent fields and makes sure they're filled out properly. If those fields are filled out properly, number 1, the information flows and I'm sorry, I'm having a PowerPoint control issue here. Here we go. That information flows into Eloqua and becomes a record in the Eloqua system. Simultaneously, and this is very important, that fact is tracked in the activity log. The consent specifically is tracked, the date that you got it, and the fact that consent is actually yes is the consent verification log. So again, we promised that in the GDPR activity log, every single activity of consent would be tracked, and that's exactly what's occurring here. Now, let's say that now theoretically, when someone imports a list, they should only import data with consent, but maybe somebody didn't get the memo. Well, then you have a record coming in here, and it's for a GDPR country. It's specifically for perhaps France, and there's no consent. The fields are not filled out properly, and it's trying to come into Eloqua without a valid basis for processing as per the law. Well, this goes into a reject log. This person can have that opportunity to correct it. Remember, these are much like locks on your front door. They keep honest people honest. Determined dishonest people can still violate the rules. But what happens here is this information is rejected, and that person either has to go find consent or not bring it into Eloqua at all. Obviously, we have a regular Eloqua import tool, and what we do typically is lock the average marketer. This is especially valuable when you have a bunch of marketers around the world who you don't have really strong direct process control over. You lock them out of the Eloqua import program, driving them to only use the GDPR upload wizard so that consent is always tracked and always verified. So next use case I'm going to talk about here is use case number 2. And this is a rep enters a new CRM contact and integrates to Eloqua. Now in this case, again, in a perfect world, the CRM system would only allow information into it with consent. Consent would be tracked, and this would sort of be bulletproof. But sometimes sales isn't quite caught up with marketing or isn't quite as compliant with the law. And you want to make sure that the information that's flowing into your Eloqua system does in fact have consent. Now in this particular case, if you're using the core Eloqua tools, we still allow the information into Eloqua, even if consent is not there, but we flag it. And we let the data steward or the DPO know that there is a problem and that they should go back and talk to the Salesforce administrator or maybe a sales rep, whoever the appropriate person is, who allowed information to flow through the system without consent. Typically, a CRM system will require anybody who's going to be put in as a new contact, who's going to receive marketing information, to first either verbalize or on a form check off that they have given consent, and then it flows over with consent. And then what happens, of course, is we track those consent fields and we check off that they have consent for ongoing segmentation and mailing purposes. So I'm going to take a quick second here. Sebastian, do we have any questions up to this point?
We have several questions which have been answered within the chat box.
Okay, I shall continue on then. So let's go on. Let's go on to use case number 4. Now in use case number 4, we have a form coming into the system. And in the case of a form coming into the system, basically what's occurring there is theoretically, again, in a perfect world, all of your forms should have a nice little checkbox that a user can consent to or not. It needs to be clear and unambiguous, and we all know how to do that. However, we have personnel changes, we have people who leave the company, we have people who might forget to put the consent in, we might have the new team member in Brazil who didn't get the memo again. And so what can happen is you can have a form out there in the wild, and all of a sudden you have European citizens flowing into the Eloqua contact table without consent, unless you have the GDPR form compliance wizard, and in this or cloud app. And in this case, again, if there is no consent, it very much like the integration, identifies that there's a problem, identifies the form, allows the DPO to go back to whoever created that form and say, hey, please either don't make this available to EU citizens or provide consent. And if consent does exist, and again, this is a very important part of it, that consent is tracked not only for integrations, not only for inputs, but also for every single form. So when somebody puts that information and checks off that consent here, we're actually tracking exactly when, how that occurred in the activity log. Next item here is use case number 3. I do these slightly out of order, but basically what's occurring here is we're sending an email. A marketer is sending an email out. And the key here is we want anybody who is in the right to be forgotten log to make sure they absolutely do not get an email. And we want to make sure that anybody that does have consent can, but if there's no consent there, again, they don't. And we want to make sure that only happens by GDPR countries, because if we do it by other countries, we lose a lot of marketing power in other countries of the world. And so basically, this is exactly what happens here. We make sure that the average marketer does not have admin capability in our particular implementation. A marketer simply cannot send to a contact who has been forgotten or who does not have consent unless they actually have it. It's just simply locked out. And this is important because sometimes human beings make mistakes. And something that, in fact, I saw this happen relatively recently. I saw somebody with a filter exactly reverse the filter. We all know how complicated ands and ors and nots can be. And they sent to everybody they shouldn't have sent to, and didn't send to everybody they should have sent to. Human error happens on occasion. The nice thing about this here is that that's simply not possible, provided you lock them out of admin ability. Okay, so I want to take a quick stop here and kind of talk about where we are, or take note of where we are. We have covered these 4 use cases. We have 3 more we're going to cover. I'm going to cover these cases a little more quickly than I did the last ones. These are the EU citizens' rights use cases. And then Tom is actually going to demonstrate the live system with these use cases actually implemented in just a couple more minutes. We're also going to touch on the reporting use case. Mostly that one is going to be shown by Tom again in a couple of minutes. So let's go on to the next use case. Now, the next use case, we've sort of combined 2 here. One is the right to access or review their information. In other words, they have to be able to see it, the personally identifiable information. And number 2, they need to be able to change it. So if you've misspelled my name, we need to be able to address that. What's also called the right to rectification. So how do we do that? Well, this is pretty straightforward. There is a form that starts the process. And that form is where somebody says, yes, I want to fill out this form that will give me the right to access or change my information. Now, obviously, we need to make sure they are who they are, since we're going to be giving them personal information. So we always confirm this via an email. This email goes to their inbox. If they don't have access to the inbox, they don't have access to the information. But if they go in that inbox and they confirm it, then the right to retrieve data goes out, collects information from the contact table, may actually collect information from custom objects. Excuse me. There we go. Collects that information and then provides it to the user in a form. Now, one of the interesting things here is you might say, well, wait a minute, we're going to give them everything in the Eloqua contact table? And the answer is absolutely not. There is a mapping capability, configuration capability here, where you can say, hey, I want to let them access this information. I want them to access and update this information, and I don't want them to see this information at all. A good example would be the Salesforce.com ID. They don't need to see that. That doesn't have any value to them, and is not something you certainly would want them to change. So that's information that you would just lock out. Just say, no, don't move that across. And there's all sorts of fields that might be appropriate for. Then there's a field like their first name that you definitely would want to give them access to, and probably access the right to change as well. So what this does then is this information then flows to, you can see that information on the form. And very important component of this is, as this occurs, every single step as this occurs is tracked. So that if they only fill out the form, we can see that. If they fill out the form and they confirm the ID, but they never open up the page, we again see that in the activity log. Or if they go all the way through it and they make some changes, again, we can see that in the activity log. There's 2 different options here based on the changes that occur. One is the changes can be directly updated and move straight back into Eloqua with no user interface. Or you can put a person in the process, and that person can basically review those changes and decide whether they go back or not. So I'd like you to take a good look at this particular use case, because we're not going to show it to you again, but Tom is going to demonstrate it to you in just a couple minutes. And so keep an eye on this one, because it's going to come back at you in a demo format in just a moment. The next use case I want to talk about is the right to be forgotten, also as the right to erasure. By the way, if it's not obvious, these blue boxes, whenever you see them, are always the EU law. Now, a lot of people, I've had occasionally people say, well, nobody's really going to ask to be forgotten, are they? And I think that, yes, citizens often take their rights very seriously. We know in the United States, people take their right to freedom of speech very seriously, for example. And Google, as an example, has already received 2.4 million requests under the right to be forgotten laws. Now, that is Google, of course, but nevertheless, I think it's reasonable to expect that right to be forgotten will be a real thing. Here is an example. Again, you'll notice that this is very similar to the last one. We have a right to be forgotten form that gets filled out. They confirm that via a link press. This app then goes out, deletes information in the contact table, deletes information in the activity log, moves those activity logs over to the right to be forgotten log, and of course, that right to be forgotten log is only accessible to the key legal people in your organization so that you comply with the law. The next use case I'm going to talk about is portability, or the right to retrieve data. And basically what the law says is you have to supply this in a structured, commonly used, machine-readable, and interoperable format, and we translate all that to mean comma-separated variable Excel-readable. And again, you'll see these processes now are starting to look kind of similar to each other because they are. Right to retrieve data form, they confirm themselves in an email, we gather this information here, somebody gets access to this after clicking on this link, they then can download their information as a CSV file, we track all of this occurring, and that is the right to data portability. Now they have a downloadable file of their data. Use case number 8. Now, I'm not going to really show you use case number 8. Basically, it's where we go into these tables and others and generate dashboards and reports. Tom will show you some beautiful dashboards and reports in just a second. I'm not going to really show them much now. And this wraps up our use cases. So we have now covered the marketing automation, CRM user internal use cases, the use cases in terms of their rights, and we've also covered a reporting use case. Obviously, there's a number of other use cases, situations where somebody exercises their right to be forgotten, but then they come back again. Or there's a whole bunch of permutations of this. In this webinar, we can only cover a certain number, so we've left them focused here. And so also I want to kind of cover that we have covered these cloud apps. We have covered these upload wizard and integration compliance cloud apps in relationship to these top use cases. We've talked about the EU citizen rights related to sort of these bottom use cases. GDPR and metrics, Tom's going to talk about more in a second in terms of the reporting use case. And there is a compliance setup app as well that goes in and sets up all of these tables and all these fields so you don't have to do it. And that's how the use cases in the cloud apps sort of interrelate to each other. To look at all that we've built up in this last 45 minutes from a webinar perspective, we have the GDPR upload wizard, which controls part of your imports. We have the form compliance and integration, which controls your inputs. We have the EU citizen rights. We have the metrics and reporting, all of this on top of the data structure. And that's sort of a 30,000-foot perspective of what's happening behind the scenes in a fully implemented GDPR Eloqua Cloud Apps environment. So with all of that, I'm going to take a quick second and check with Sebastian if there are any questions, and then turn this over to Tom Sychek, Forethought Marketing CTO and co-founder, a brilliant fellow, if I do say so for him. Sebastian, any questions we should address?
Sure, Mark. We have one here. It says, for the existing contacts in Eloqua, what can we do to make them GDPR compliant? Is the GDPR new law only applicable to the new contact data to be collected?
No, the GDPR law is any data, first of all, let me define what processing means. Processing means anytime you store data on someone, anytime you move data related to someone, or anytime you do what's typically referred to as processing a calculation or a processing of some sort on their actual name and so forth. So anytime you store or move or process information is really broad. And so for all of your existing contacts that are GDPR citizens, you're required to provide these rights and track consent for them. This is for both the ones that you have in your database today and the ones that you acquire in the future. I'll also mention that there was recently a fine filed by the ICO against Honda and Flybe, 2 fines actually. One was 58,000 pounds and one was about 30,000 pounds. And what they did is they took their existing database and sent an email out to them and said, hey, GDPR is coming. Will you please give us consent to email to you? And they got fined because there is already a law on the books that says you can't email to people who haven't given you consent. And so while trying to get consent, they got fined for not having consent. So yes, this applies both to your existing records in your database and those that are future gathered. Any more questions, Sebastian?
I think we can move on to the demo portion now with Tom. However, we would like to ask you to submit your questions in the Q&A area instead of the chat box. It is a lot easier for us to track them and make sure that they are all answered, either during the call or offline. So with that said, Tom, it's all yours.
Okay, can people hear me and can you see my screen?
I can.
Yep. Okay, I'll take that as a yes. So this is our sandbox instance. So there's a lot of things in here. We have about 7.5 million contacts and about 3.5 million are considered GDPR contacts, just to give you a sense of the database we're working with here. So a couple of the apps that Mark talked about are actually on the app menu. Some of you may be familiar with the app menu in Eloqua, the GDPR Upload Wizard and the GDPR Dashboard. And I'm going to go through both of these as well as one of the rights processes. So I'm going to start with the Upload Wizard. I have this all preloaded. And basically this gives you the opportunity to load an Excel spreadsheet similar to what you would do with the current Upload Wizard in Eloqua. So I'm just going to grab a new shared list. I'm going to put it in a folder in our testing area. I'm going to put it in my GDPR testing folder. And then I'm going to grab a spreadsheet. So it's my upload demo spreadsheet. And I'm going to upload it. And this will bring up a list of all the fields on the spreadsheet. Some of these are very familiar: email, address, country, first name, last name. We also have some fields in here that are the fields that we use to check compliance. So we want to make sure there's compliance type and import type, source, date, etc. These fields are normally not mapped to a contact record. They're actually stored in our activity log and in the consent verification table. So you'll see these are not mapped. Once I save this mapping, what the system's going to do is go and check compliance against those fields. So it's going to come back and tell you, yes, these fields exist in the Excel spreadsheet. So that's the first thing we're doing, is making sure that the fields are there. If any of these required fields are missing, the entire file will be rejected. And then when I hit next, what it's going to do is go out and see if any of these contacts already have consent in the system. And if consent already exists, we skip all compliance checking because we already have compliance for them. And for anybody who's new or we don't have consent, what it's going to do is go and check if that data is compliant. And if so, it will add it to the activity file. And if not, it's going to add it to the reject log. What happened here is that I received an email that tells me how many records were in the file, how many were imported to Eloqua. So there are 3 good records, and there were 5 rejected records. And then I can look at those rejected records. So I get a file sent to me that looks like this, that just tells me what the rejected records look like, why there was a reject. So in this case, we had an invalid country value because the right value for the UK is actually GB for Great Britain. Here we had a missing activity date. We had a missing compliance type. So in this case, what we can do is go back and fix the data and re-import the list and get everything back to where we want it to be. So that's a quick view of the Upload Wizard. Again, as Mark said, we recommend that you turn off the Eloqua version and have everybody use this wizard, because if the contacts are not in the EU, then it will just send the contacts through without doing compliance checking. But if somebody is, say, in the US and loading a number of contacts from around the world, it will do the compliance checking for those contacts that are in the EU, even if the person doing the upload is not, because that's what the law requires you to do. So that's the Upload Wizard. Very quick demo on that. Next thing I want to do is show you the right to update information process. So I'm going to show you a couple screenshots. So this would be a form, it would be branded rather than for Forethought Marketing, obviously it would be branded for your company. This page is normally a link off of your privacy page. So on your privacy page, you would say if you'd like to exercise your right to update your information, there would be a link, and a page like this would come up. When it comes up, we would, all we need is your email address, and we get a little, confirmation that we received your request. And then we get an email that basically confirms their identity. So in this case, what we want to do is, it's kind of like a double opt-in. You're saying, I want information about T-Site-Check at Forethought Marketing, and now we're getting an email back to T-Site-Check saying, are you really you, and did you really ask for this right to be exercised? When I click on this confirm my identity, what will happen is I will get taken to a screen that will look something like this. These fields are all configurable by you. We do that as part of our setup for identifying which fields are going to be displayed on the update, and this would be the same as the right to access or right to portability. So we would have the fields that are going to be displayed, the value that we currently have, and then if the individual wants to update their data, they can come in here. And so, for example, I may want to say my name is really Thomas as opposed to Tom. And we also have the ability to show records that are derived data. So, for example, my title might be CTO, and we derived job level CXO. So you can have information that is derived data that you still want them to see, but they shouldn't be able to change it. We can also show here, we don't on this demo, but we can also show if you have submitted any forms, if you've clicked on any emails or been sent any emails, even down to which web pages you have visited. So any of the activity information that's in the Eloqua system, we can add that on here as well. And if you have information in custom objects that includes personal information, we can include the custom object personal information on here as well. So if I were to hit update here, it would go and update my data, and now we have exercised my right to update the data, and the individual can move on from there. So it's a quick overview of how we set up the rights area. And again, it can extend out. The information that's displayed here is very specific to your company, and is really a lot of it has to do with the business decision and how compliant, going back to Mark's analogy about the speed limit, how much of that information do you want people to see and update. The last thing I want to show you is the dashboard. So the dashboard comes again off of the app menu. So it's just a link off the app menu, and we have a number of dashlets in here that shows how you're performing against standards in terms of how well your risk level is. In this case, we have the number of GDPR contacts that have yes, that have a no, or that we don't have a record on. So we have a lot of records in our database with no compliance whatsoever. We then show you the errors from the reject and error compliance log. How many form errors? We would like to see this number go down over time, obviously. The number of import errors, the number of integration errors. These are from the compliance apps. So the form compliance app, the integration compliance app, and the upload wizard. And then just a total number of errors over time that shows you how well you're doing in terms of bringing data in that is compliant. We then show you the status of your database. So how many GDPR records have been added, how many have been added with consent, and how have those how those contacts come in. So over time, how many have come in through list imports, through form submits, and through integration. So you get a good view of just the amount of activity going on in your database. We then show you a quick view of the world. So how well are you doing on a country by country basis? Those contacts that are in green are doing very well with their compliance. Those in red are not doing so well. And if you wanted to look at that information on a country by country basis, you could see the details behind that as well. And then finally, we show you the number of people who have exercised their rights. the right to access, update, portable, right to be forgotten, and then the total rights exercised in this last quarter. So it's a quick overview of some of our apps, how they might apply to your situation. This dashboard is accessible to anybody that you want to have access to this. We also have the ability for you to set up scheduling so these reports can be sent out to the DPO or to other individuals on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis as well. The one report I don't show here because for privacy reasons you wouldn't make it public would be the right to be forgotten, and would show the number of people who have asked to be forgotten over time as well. So with that, Sebastian, I'm going to hand it back to you, and we'll consider the demo complete.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tom. This was great. We have a few pending questions in the Q&A section. I will let Mark
I can
address.
see these. I'll go ahead and jump in on them. So let me see. I'll just come through a few of them here. One of them is one that's come up a couple times is regarding email address. Currently, we do not accommodate, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, currently we do not accommodate somebody changing their email address. However, one could always exercise the right to be forgotten under one email address and resupply it under another email address. Something else you can do is in a right to be forgotten, or excuse me, in a right to change form, you can always put a box at the bottom that's just basically a text box that says, hey, for anything else you'd like to change that's not supplied here, please write us a note and we'll do it. You can obviously route that to somebody manually, and then you could accommodate that from a manual perspective. Another question here is, are these tools only available to existing clients for your company? If you were to buy these cloud apps, you would become a client for our company. So I suppose the answer to that question is yes. They are not sort of free tools available in the wild, if that's perhaps the implication there. Another question is, what is the cost of your apps? Thanks for that question. I think that would better be addressed on a one-on-one basis. There is a sliding scale based on quantity of records in your Eloqua database. Be happy to supply you and answer that. And Sebastian, if you capture the name there, we'll make sure we address that. Anyone else who's interested, just let us know. There's another question here. What values are in the consent type field and the other fields that are being evaluated? I think it's beyond the scope of this webinar to go into all of the values of all of the select lists of all of the fields in terms of the consent type field. So I think a question that's being asked there, I'm going to have to interpret a little bit here. I think that there's something in GDPR called categories of processing. And you get to determine what the appropriate categories of processing are for your organization. So I think when you're talking about type of consent, I think that's what the question is referring to. The consent type field would typically, in a B2B Eloqua sort of environment, would have consent for categories like marketing, support, maybe something separate like support marketing, sales, and perhaps order processing or operations. Those are the high-level sort of consent types or processing types categories that we typically recommend. Any advice on how to anonymize IP address is a good question. Illegal is asking for this. So basically, our perspective on this is that if you I assume this is related to the right to be forgotten. If someone is forgotten, how do you forget them in relationship to their IP address as well? And this usually relates to the cookie that is on their system, that Eloqua drops on their system. And so basically our perspective on this, and again, remember that there are different levels of compliance. You know, it will be a while before Eloqua, the Oracle, the organization, the product Eloqua becomes fully and completely in every dimension capable of full GDPR compliance. For example, there are some issues with deleting certain types of activity records and so forth. Our general perspective, though, is that if you delete a contact, web tracking that is tied to that contact is basically no longer has a first name, last name, email tied to them, and we consider that web cookie orphaned or sort of out there in the wild. The individual out there in the wild could then go in on their own computer because they have control of their own browser and delete those cookies if they wanted to, or leave them there. And we believe that's reasonably good compliance with the right to be forgotten law. I don't see any other questions. Sebastian, do you see any that I haven't answered that are, oh, here's one. Is it recommended that existing records in your database not GDPR be deleted if you don't have recommendation on how to reach out to them to make them compliant? Yeah, so that's, I think the question that's being asked there is, if you have an EU citizen's record in your system today and you don't have consent, should we delete them? The answer in relationship to the law is that you don't have a right to process an EU citizen's data if you don't have consent or some legitimate basis for processing that information. Now, if someone has submitted a form request to get an asset, you have a legitimate basis to fulfill that asset and retain that record for the time it takes to deliver that asset and perhaps even, I've seen a number of companies interpret this to also mean follow up on to see whether they received it. That is what one good example of legitimate interest. If you don't have legitimate interest and you don't have consent and you don't have a contractual basis for processing, unless you're an emergency service, you probably don't have one of the other three, you wouldn't have a basis for processing their data, and to be perfectly legally compliant, yes, you should delete their data. Recommendations on how to reach out to them to make them compliant. Anything, well, first of all, before May 25th, to try and move fast. And again, remember that if you don't have consent, you may not be able to email them, but you may be able to reach out to them in other ways. And again, you can use your Salesforce and your reps to reach out to them. You can reach out to them through snail mail. You may be able to reach out to them through social media en masse. Say, hey, we're about to go under GDPR. If you'd like to receive stuff from us, please let us know. I don't know about the law here. I think you might be able to tweet them. That would be something to double check with your attorneys, and that's probably the best I can give on that question.
Mark, I have another comment about that question. I'm not sure if this is what was being asked, but I'm going to answer it. And that is, when we look at GDPR contacts, we look at 3 different sets of individuals who we consider to be under the GDPR regulations. Certainly, if they are in a country in the EU that's under GDPR, we consider that to be the GDPR contact. There are 2 other groups of individuals, though. If country is blank, we recommend that you consider them to be GDPR, because if you don't know and they are, you could be out of compliance by reaching out to them. And similarly, most companies that we have dealt with have some garbage data in their database. And so if your country value is not recognizable, that means you can't, there's data there, but you can't tell which country they're in. We also recommend that you consider them to be a GDPR contact as well.
All right. I think we can stop a little bit early here. Like to thank everybody for their time. I don't have any more questions coming up. If you would like to reach out to Forethought Marketing, we of course have a contact us form on our website at www.forethoughtmarketing.com. We also are happy to answer any additional questions we can help you with on GDPR, as well as, of course, any specific questions regarding our cloud apps, pricing, and so forth. Sebastian, Tom, anything else?
Just thank you, everyone for joining us. And I hope this was a very valuable session to all of you. As Mark said, we'll be looking forward to addressing any additional questions separately. Tom, anything from you?
Thanks for being here. Appreciate all the questions and all the interest.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Bye-bye, everybody.